I'm a political philosopher, and so I'm going to roll some political philosophy on you. I'm aware that it's the third session of the afternoon, that you've had lunch, a talk, then tea and biscuits. So I promise that as I roll this political philosophy on you, it will not be painful. That is, I promise it will not be painful unless you walked in here today and are sitting there now having a political philosophy. And if you are sitting there having a political philosophy and holding a political philosophy, you may find yourself begin to feel some pain as I speak. And that pain may increase as I go on. If you have that experience and begin to feel some pain when I'm about to tell you, do not be alarmed. For what is pain? Pain is merely weakness leaving the body. For a long time now, decades, 4 decades, 5 decades, the train of political philosophy, the train over which political theorists have debates about the requirements of justice, of democracy, and of liberty, for many decades now, that terrain has lain in a deep freeze. There's a divide among the philosophers, an ideological divide among the philosophers, that mirrors a divide in popular politics in many countries, certainly the US, perhaps now in India too, a divide between left and right. As I think of that divide on the academic side, and I think about my philosopher friends, the divide resembles a frozen sea, a frozen windswept sea, with camps staked out on opposite sides of this windswept divide. And across that windswept sea with a frozen ice on the top, those little tufts of snow get blown across it, but there's a really howling wind that goes across that divide. It howls so loudly that, in fact, parties on both sides can barely hear each other. Off one coast is the camp of the academically embattled camp of the libertarians and the classical liberals. As I picture the classical liberals and the libertarians, they're hunkered down in tents on the ice. The wind is blowing really hard, and it's kind of flapping on the doors of the thing. But they kind of like it. I was in that camp for a really long time, and I know there's a certain frisson for being embattled that way. But they know, the tent people know, the libertarians, the traditional libertarians know that though the winds may howl and though it gets pretty nippy in there sometimes, they know that the tent's not going to go anywhere. They've got these stakes given to them long ago by John Locke, hammered deep into the ice, and let the winds howl, they'll still be there in the morning. Across the divide, on the other side, up on a little hill, is the academically more luxurious camp of the left liberals, or as they call themselves, the modern liberals, or as they sometimes revealingly call themselves, the high liberals, or socialists even. At that camp, as I picture them, they're not in tents, but rather, in igloos, blocked together mainly by this guy, John Rawls, in the early 1970s. And in those igloos, there are heaters, there's probably dishes that let them see televisions, there's furs, faux furs. But they're pretty warm in their tent. And in that academic embattled camp, the tents across the other side, the tent people, they talk about property rights. And they talk about the importance of limited government and individual responsibility. But in that camp, the tent people's camp, the phrase social justice is only rarely or dismissively heard. That's the camp that gives intellectual firepower to popular movements in the US like the Tea Party, and perhaps to politicians, and to some politicians on the right in India as well. On the other side, the high liberal camp, the people in the igloos, they have a different language, and they have a different thing they talk about. Their battle standard is social justice. And they're very enthusiastic about the ability of the state to produce social justice or to deliver social justice. And in that camp, the igloo people's camp, they speak only very dismissively about private economic liberties. They are reluctant capitalists, as one of my teachers, Ronald Dworkin, once proudly described himself. And this is the camp that gives intellectual firepower to popular movements such as the Occupy Wall Street movement that swept the world. It's the camp, I suppose, that channels the ghost of Gandhi in India. Here's a philosophy now. not so bad. What I want to point you to is that these divides between these ideologies, the tent people kind of get 2 tents. It's a pretty small camp, but they get 2 tents. These are the igloo people. It's a much bigger crowd of them. In fact, if you threw a snowball down the hallway at any leading philosophy department in America, you couldn't help but hit a high liberal. Same is true of Oxford and other places. But anyway, these 2 camps and the popular movements that they give rise to, the division between these ideologies is rooted and gets its nature of intractability because they're rooted in the end, at the very base, in a fundamentally different way of understanding moral personality. Most political philosophers, to varying degrees of self-awareness, ground their ideas about how we should live together, what politics should be like, in some understanding of what a human being is like. Politics is a study of how humans should live together. So it makes sense to think, well, if you want to know what the answer to that question, you ought to know what a human being is. Then you can figure out how they should live together. So for example, I won't do them all, I'll just give you a simplified version. But we're going to go with the libertarians. Libertarians, way back in the beginning, I see libertarianism as a view rooted primarily in the work, or at least canonically in the work of say, John Locke. And Locke's argument is if you want to know how we should organize the state, we should try to strip away these features of our experience and think about, do a thought experiment regarding the state of nature and ask ourselves what would we be like before the state, then we can know something what the state should be like. Locke's argument, which I'm sure most of you know, it's kind of a hill. Locke says that we are in the state of nature before there's a pre-political man, is a self-owner. Owning ourselves, we own our labor too. We can mix our labor with unknown things out there in the world and come to own those things. So Locke says out there in the state of nature, we are self-owners who come to own property. And Locke sees property built into the very fabric of the universe. God created the man, humans, and God created the universe. And interestingly, God decided to create human beings so they fit in the universe in a certain way. So for example, we have mouths, we have stomachs that get hungry. Out there in nature, there are trees, which give things like apples. It turns out that if you take the apple off the tree and put it in your mouth, it goes into your stomach, you satisfy your needs. It's almost as though property is built into the very fabric of the universe. So presto changeo, if you're a libertarian, starting with those kind of premises, you do it different ways too, but starting with the self-ownership idea, you reason naturalistically, and you start asking yourself, now what should the state be like? What we should think about what rights we have in the state of nature. And you get, with Locke, the idea the state should, maybe the most important thing it should do, it should be to protect those natural rights, most notably the right to property. And you can run a different way with the classical liberals in a more utilitarian way. I'll leave that aside for now. I'll talk more about that if you want to hear about that. Across the divide, though, are people who start in a very different place. They begin, the high liberals, the people in the igloos, they begin not with the idea of a self-owner, but something like a Rousseauian idea of something like a democratic citizen. They think that what we're really like when it comes time to argue about politics are beings that have these 2 capacities, these 2 moral capacities. On the one hand, each of us, these people say, now I'm running this line, they say we begin with this other idea. We have these 2 moral powers. First, we have the capacity to set ourselves on a course of life. And the plan of life we develop for ourselves is incredibly important to us. After all, it's our life. That's our first moral power. But we also, these people say, have a second moral power, a second capacity. We have the capacity to recognize that each of our fellow citizens, people out there in the world, they have lives to lead too. And those lives are incredibly important to them. Notice that by admitting that, you don't automatically become a person who's one of the slaves of other people. They just begin now with that idea that the puzzle is that human beings have these 2 powers, these two ways of seeing the world, these 2 ways of doing moral evaluations. And they want to know, well, how do we figure out from that beginning idea of the person what the state should be like? They think that we figure it out, because of man's social nature, is through a process of deliberation or public reasoning. So they imagine parties deliberating together, asking one another, well, how do we fit my interest in my life and my interest in your life together with your interest in your life and your interest in my life? How do we figure out how we're going to live together? And as they reason that way, they say, well, one of the things we're going to find out is that institutions that we come up with have to be acceptable to everyone. including the least well-off, because they have lives that matter to them too. But fortunately, we have the capacity to care about them, so no worries. We think that social justice is one of the most important concepts, maybe the most important concept. And what sometimes say what the state should do, the state should pursue social justice. That's kind of a long sort of setup, but I take the time to do it because it shows, I think, that it shows the intractability of the debate. It shows why things have been so bad for so long in the academy. Because these debates about philosophy undergird the debates about politics. And I remember as a graduate student, when I was first starting to see this map, as a graduate student, I went to Oxford, and I was so excited because I thought I was going to hang out with some philosophers, and we were going to sit down and have serious conversations about what's the best way to understand human nature. I thought fabulous. I'm going to go sit with some of the best philosophers in the world, and we're going to sort this out together. But it was interesting because we never sorted it out. Didn't even come close to it. I would try with a couple people sometimes, but no one wanted to talk about it. And the reason was, we all knew that whoever won this debate was going to win this debate. And people's political views are often connected to these things first, and they sort of find this stuff later on. They claim this is where they start, but in fact, we're often have a lot of ideological baggage behind our philosophical conversations. So the philosophers wouldn't have the conversation because the philosophical conversation was infected by this rigid straitjacket, the fact that the arguments run in those rigid ways. So you get what we have today, a divide between economic liberty or social justice, capitalism or democracy, Frederick Hayek or John Rawls, market mania or market phobia, Narendra Modi on the economic side or the ghost of Gandhi, free markets or fairness, one side or the other, everybody's got to choose. I don't like it. I haven't liked it for a long time. But I bring you good news. And my students at Brown, who I don't know, they're Christian culture at least, they call it the gospel according to John. But I'm not the only disciple of this new creed. There's a movement that's already been mentioned called Bleeding Heart Libertarianism. There's a blog that you should check out. It's one of the most popular blogs in philosophy now called Bleeding Heart Libertarianism. There are political actors who, in my view, are heroes of this movement. Deirdre mentioned Sweden being a not bad place and maybe a capitalist place. It's worth noting that Sweden is only becoming that, and in fact, increasingly becoming more and more that. One of the reasons Sweden's becoming that is because of charismatic, thoughtful people like Anders Borg, who's the finance minister of Sweden. And if you go to YouTube and look up Anders Borg, you'll be in for a treat. He looks like a Swede. He's got a ponytail and the earring going. But he gives talks at right-wing places like the American Enterprise Institute, and he says the most extreme right-wing things in democratic language. Among the things Anders Borg says is that when his party first came to power, 25% of adult Swedes were on direct governmental assistance, and Borg, the Swede, said, in Sweden, we can't do that to each other. We owe each other the chance to have all our fellow citizens the chance to support themselves. And Anders Borg goes around Europe bragging about his Work First program, a program which he says is designed to make work more comfortable than welfare in Sweden. He thinks it's important for democracy that people have the ability to support themselves, and he wants to tailor things to make that happen. What I try to do is, the way I try to do it philosophically, is to combine economic liberty and social justice. And bang, one more chart. What I've done is I start up here with my 10 people friends. And like my 10 people friends, I have some very settled intuitions about work that I'll say more about in a moment. And I decided to leave the 10 people behind. I loaded up my insights, though, from them about the importance of economic liberty, put them aboard a little icebreaker, and then I sort of chugged across the frozen sea, down across to the democratic citizens conception. When I actually finally got honest with myself about what I thought the best way to think about politics was, I found the democratic citizen way much more attractive. I just think it's a more morally powerful idea to begin a way of thinking about politics. I never could see that before because it always meant I'd have to be a lefty, and I'm not a lefty. But I really think that's the best way to start. What I did was take my little icebreaker, and I came over and joined the other side. When I joined them, I did one little twist, that is I sort of jammed on the accelerator of my icebreaker as I came over to their other side, and I smashed really hard into their ice flow. Gently, kindly, because we're all friends now. But my idea was to break up the ice beneath the ice flows, so that now we started doing deliberations, democratic deliberations, we could actually maybe start asking some new questions. Questions that hadn't been asked, because in the past, the people who cared about economic liberty were all forced up to these other kind of views. But now, if someone cares about economic liberty and genuinely joins the democratic side, we can have some interesting new conversations. Questions like these. Is deliberative democracy a vehicle that can only make left turns? Kind of weird, right? Just the fact that we're going to deliberate together automatically means we have to go left and left and left. Why would that be? Why don't we deliberate, in fact, and maybe go right or in some other direction? Or more precisely, I ask my fellow democratic citizens now, collectively, as we have our deliberations, do we really best respect our fellow citizens as free and responsible authors of their own lives by seeking to use the state to limit their economic liberty? Is that really the way we show respect for our fellow citizens? And as you can see, what I do is reason democratically, deliberatively, and I think that the best account of democracy is one which combines the concern for economic liberty with a concern for social justice. So we need to find a way to defend economic liberty while being committed to the idea that in a decent society, especially a wealthy society like America, no one should be left behind. But we also can't lose sight of the fact that people have a liberty interest in economic decision-making for themselves. So how can you get that? If you can get it, you're going to combine those uncombinables that I described a few minutes ago: economic liberty and social justice, capitalism and democracy, Hayek and Rawls, Tea Party and Occupy, free markets and fairness. So how do you get it? Well, you need two things philosophically. You need, first, a democratic argument for private economic liberties. Remember, if you do what I do and you leave behind the utilitarian or the self-ownership styles of reasoning about economic liberty, you can't defend economic liberty for those reasons anymore. You need to defend them now in public reasons terms. So can you find a public reason argument for very strong private economic liberties? Second thing you have to do, you need an account of social justice that is an account of this idea that in a decent society, no one should be left behind, that's compatible with recognizing strong private economic liberties. That looks hard on its face, right? Because liberties, when you recognize a liberty, you limit the ability of the government to act in that area. If you recognize economic liberties, you're going to tie the hands of, let's imagine, well-meaning legislators in the area of social justice. So how can you get a conception of social justice that's going to be compatible with economic liberty? So the way I do it is through a theory of fairness. And there's a formulation method I like. We should regard as the most desired order of society the one we would choose if we knew that our initial position in it would be determined purely by chance, such as the fact of our being born into a particular family. And it's worth pausing to see the power of that fairness-based idea. The idea is that if we're trying to reason out what those requirements of democratic citizenship might mean, we should imagine ourselves making choices about social institutions behind a kind of a veil which makes us ignorant about who in particular we're going to be in that society. That idea of the veil of ignorance is going to model our commitment to fairness, our commitment to this idea that we recognize the importance of each of our fellow citizens' lives to them. And that matters to us. It doesn't matter infinitely. Our lives matter too. We see their lives matter with them. So if you reason that way, what are you going to get? And just by the way, some people do philosophy or read Western philosophy know who this is? Any students know? Yeah, it's not. Sure, it looks like John Rawls, right? It smells like John Rawls. It sort of feels like John Rawls. But it's actually Friedrich Hayek. And it's Hayek from 1940. And Hayek reports that in 1940, as he was in London and the bombing was getting really bad, he sent letters around. He received some invitations from around the world for people to take his kids to raise them in case he was killed. And he says he started him thinking about how would you choose a fair society? So Hayek, 30 years before Rawls, came up with this idea, and which, by the way, since Hayek came up with it before Rawls, this should probably be called the original position, which renders Rawls' position the unoriginal position. But anyway, so using this Hayekian Rawlsian method, what do we get? What do we get when we reason this way? So I think you get two things. First, you're going to get an argument for economic liberty. And I'll say a word about that. Then I'll say something second about social justice. So first, economic liberty. I mentioned that I was a card-carrying orthodox libertarian for a long time. And the reason why I was a libertarian, for me at least, was that came from personal experience. Someone this morning, I think it was Arthur, talked about the awareness of the importance of economic liberties as a middle-class virtue, not so much a working-class one. My family is very working-class, not middle-class. We still aspire to be middle-class. My grandparents came as children from northern Italy to America. They've been working in stone quarries in northern Italy, and when they came to America, they did what they know how to do, which is cut stone. And they moved to a town in Vermont called Barrie, Vermont, where they worked in the quarries. And my grandfather, to the our continuing pride in our family, saved up enough money from his stone cutting to start a small fruit stand. And he had a fruit stand which he didn't have a monkey with an accordion, which would have been the perfect Italian cliche, but he was pretty close to that. And he dreamt of a day when his son or grandson would go to college. And my family all still lives there, and they still work in the quarries. They're like the hardest working people I've ever met in my life. The quarry's fallen on hard times, and so have we. But they're really, really hard workers, and they think I'm a freak. They have I'm the laziest. They can't believe how lazy I am, and they're still sort of baffled by this thing. They're proud that I went to college and so on, but they don't get it at all. I was with my I have an aunt named Aunt Rose Lorenzini, and I was with Aunt Rose just after I got my PhD from Oxford, and Rose was bragging about me to one of her neighbors, and she said, "This is my nephew Johnny. Johnny went to college," and the neighbor went, "Wow." And then Aunt Rose says, "Yeah, and then he went to college again." I was like, "Well, no," but actually that's literally what they think about it. But working with them, living with them, and growing up in that my father ran a store for a while too. Living with them, I felt it was obvious to me how important economic liberties were and having those ambitions from a working class perspective. When I went to Oxford, as I started moving my way through the academic world, up the rungs and academic ladders, to Oxford and Princeton and Stanford, I kept meeting people who had just a completely different worldview, who just didn't see this stuff at all. And I realized that worldview, I think it's rooted in ideas that I see it rooted, the skepticism of economic liberty, which is so prevalent in the academy, is rooted, I think, in the work of John Stuart Mill. In the 1850s, John Stuart Mill, the great defender of liberty, described all of the different domains of life, of activity, in which we become who we are and express our nature. But Mill thought that economic activity was just a drudgery thing we had to do to get free. Mill was aristocratic enough to not think that work could be intrinsically valuable, that the domain of saving or striving or trying to get your tomatoes better to sell to your neighbor or to get your grandson to a place where he could go to college and go to college again, that whole thing, which is the kind of drudgery we have to go through. So too, maybe more dramatically, even John Maynard Keynes wrote this lovely essay that some of us have been talking about over the weekend, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And that an essay, do some of you know that essay? I highly recommend it. It's short, it's beautiful, it's wonderfully written. Whatever you think of Keynes, he's a master stylist. You should absolutely read that essay. It is the best window into the mind of the left that I know of. In that essay, though, Keynes says that within 100 years, he's writing in 1930, within 100 years, he says, Western economies will have grown by about 10 times, less than Deirdre claims we have. And at that point, he says, the economic problem will have been solved. Solved. My parents would be, what? Solved? It will be solved. And when it's solved, Keynes says, we can finally at least admit to each other that those bourgeois virtues of striving and withdrawing things and saving up, all that stuff, the stuff that's so basic to my family's experience, are actually not virtues at all, but in fact are morbid neuroses. And Keynes says people who cling to those purposive virtues and activities when the day of prosperity arrives should be consigned to mental institutions for correction. He says worse things about the Jews, but I'll leave it at that for now. So too, John Rawls, the great theorist of democracy, writing in 1971, he, like Lord Keynes, looked down his long nose at those bourgeois virtues of my family. So too, John Rawls, writing in 1971, when he does his little technical twist on Hayek, the unoriginal position, he gets a bunch of rights and liberties out of that. But among the rights and liberties now, this very pared down list of rights and liberties include hardly any economic freedom at all. So there's a right to occupational choice, but it's a very narrowly constrained right. You can choose what occupation you can do, but you can't choose the terms. You're not allowed to make choices about that at all. That's a democratic question, not a personal question of freedom. So too, he says there's a right to personal property, my coat on my back, but not a right to own productive property. So liberalism now is compatible with the state ownership of productive property. So that whole line relegates the importance of private economic liberty to a very secondary place. I think that's the great divide within liberal societies, that question about what we think about the moral importance of private economic liberty. As I mentioned, I came to the idea that economic liberties were valuable before I even knew what political philosophy was. I was weaned thinking that was an obviously important part of life. When I started reading philosophy and started looking around for the arguments and make maps of things, the place that I really got the argument in the book that I used in the book was from feminism. And feminists, especially in the 19th century, a lot of feminists were very alert to the importance of private economic liberty. And some feminists in the West argue that no matter how much material stuff you're given, a woman's given, no matter how gilded the cage or the glass house that she's kept within, no matter how often the seeds get changed and freshened up and the water gets freshened up, no matter how nice the swing is that she's allowed to swing on, or she falls and breaks her wing and gets it taped up however tenderly, put back on the swing to be swung again, no matter how lovely the cage is, if women are denied the opportunity or the respect that there would be given by being causes of their having those cages, that cage they're living within, that is, if they're denied the chance to be, in some sense, a cause of that state of affairs, then no matter how lovely the cage is, they've still been fundamentally disrespected in some way. There's something morally wrong about giving things if it means you're being denied, forcibly denied, the chance to get them for yourself. Those things are in tension with each other. And my idea is to take that feminist insight and turn it and train it against the ideals of the European social democracies. Because what matters is not just what we have, it also matters how we get those things. And there's a moral argument for economic liberty built into those, seen by feminists, that are can be built into a critique of a lot of the ambitions of the social democrats. And it's just that more about economic liberty, I noticed this strange thing as a college teacher. Students at Brown, especially as freshmen and sophomores, are really happy people. They walk into my office, happy as clams. Richard's son went to Brown. I didn't meet him, but I bet he walked around happy as a clam for the first couple of years. Oh, taking a little bit of this, changing my major again to that. Life's such a happy, wonderful, cheery place. But then I notice, starts around junior year, but certainly by the middle of their senior year, and then by spring of senior year, they come in with this grim look on their face. Because they're now realizing, oh, my dad or whoever is not going to pay for this anymore. I've actually got to get a job, and the job that I choose is actually going to define who I am, and it's going to limit my life prospects in some dramatic way. I'm actually now reaching the point in my life, specifically because I'm now being forced to make economic decisions for myself that are actually going to affect the whole course of my life. And that's grim. It's a grim thing. What's that grim thing called? It's called growing up. It's sad to leave behind childhood and late adolescence, but economic decision-making is the passageway from adolescence into adulthood. The feminists saw that too. They were being denied adulthood. So too, I think, citizen societies that are denied those opportunities to think for themselves about those economic things. Things like asking yourself, if I make some money, should I spend it now on some TV that's for sale, or should I save it and invest it for later on? Those kinds of choices distinctively require that we think hard about the relationship between the person we are right now and the person we're going to become in the future. That's a fundamentally adult kind of thinking. It's a fundamentally life-defining type of thinking. And economic thinking, I think, gives that to us in a particularly powerful way. That's a very quick way of saying that there can be a democratic case for economic liberty. And those who want to limit economic liberty, the kind of questions Tom Palmer was pushing on Stephen Luce before, I think the democratic people have to answer them using public reasons arguments. And that means to explain why it's appropriate, why it's respectful to limit people's private economic liberty. What about social justice? So you can get a strong argument, I think, for thick economic liberties, not absolute economic liberties of the sort the libertarians had. We can talk about how they use different from strict libertarianism, if you like, later on, but very powerful arguments, public reasons arguments for a much wider range of economic liberties than John Stuart Mill, Lord Keynes, and the saintly John Rawls recognized. What about social justice, though? Remember, if we're going to reason democratically, one of the things, if we're thinking now of people as beings that have their own lives that they think are important, but also having the capacity to recognize that each of their fellow citizens have a life that's important too, and if we're really going to honor that, both of those powers, then one of the things that comes out of that, I think, is some very powerful idea that in a just society should be acceptable to all the members who live within it. And that means something like, in a decent and just society, a democratic society, no class should be left behind. There should be no institutions should operate in such a way that no group gets exploited by the other ones. So now how can we get that? How can you make sense of social justice, which I think is you're committed to if you reason the way I'm now reasoning, that's compatible with those very strong private economic liberties? Again, private economic liberties are going to limit the power of government in the economic domain. It's going to tie their hands from doing a lot of the things that the old left thought the state should be doing. So how do you get it? Well, I'll make 2 points. The question now is, well, what does fairness require? So let's go back to the Hayek's original position. Oops, wrong way. Hayek's original position, the Rawlsian position. What do you get out of this? Well, there's a strange question that philosophers ask. It's going to sound strange, but it's important to see what the question is. They often ask, what is it that social justice is a property of? Right? So, put more simply, if you have a machine like this, a device of representation like this, and you reason out of it, and you get what you're going to get, hopefully, is a theory of social justice, which is kind of a metric, a measuring stick, we might say. Well, now the question I'm asking is, once we get the measuring stick out of the theory, to what does it apply? What is the theories of social justice, principles of justice, a property of? One answer, which Rawls rejects, and it's clearly wrong, is that justice is a property of the distributions in society at any given moment. So you would take, on that view, that mistaken view, you'd say that justice is a property of, take a snapshot of America or India or the world, wherever it is, right now, and take the principles and apply it to that to see whether it's just or unjust. For all kinds of technical reasons and also more accessible moral reasons, that cannot be what social justice is a property of. So Nozick has an example about the Wilt Chamberlain example, criticizing the idea about justice being a property of patterns. The problem is that if people act freely, they'll upset the patterns. So if you think justice is a property of patterns, of distributions, the state will have to be constantly intervening to redistribute things. There's a more technical argument that Rawls gives in his early articles that Hayek cites. Hayek read Rawls better than Nozick did by far. In the early articles, Rawls says that if we think that the principles of justice are going to be a property of distributions, then there'll be no solution to this problem. Nothing will come out of it at all. You can't reason your way. It'll be indeterminate because the human activity will constantly be changing the moral intuitions. You can't get any metric at all. So instead, here's a crucial part. Social justice, according to Rawls and Hayek, is a property not of distributions. Rather, it's a property of institutions. Sorry, it's not a property of distributions. Justice is a property of institutions viewed as working holistically over time, say over the course of a generation or two. Recall this morning that Deirdre several times talked about in a generation or two. That actually is the language of social justice. That's the target. They want to know what whole set of social institutions allowed to operate through time over the course of a generation or two would satisfy these standards. So that's a really important feature about social justice. A lot of people on the libertarian side, my friends, have what I call social justice-itis, which is an allergic reaction to social justice. Part of the reason why they have that horrible malady, which makes them so nervous and itchy when I give these kinds of talks, is that they think that justice is a property of distributions. It's not, at least not by the most sophisticated people on the left. So justice is a property now of institutions viewed holistically through time across the course of a generation or two. Social justice in that, viewed that way, does not obviously allow us to correct things at any given moment to make it accord with some pattern. That's not what justice requires. Justice requires that we think about the institutions and how they tend to operate over time. That's an important point. Now, the second point, you'll see why the first point is important. Now we ask finally, what exactly does social justice require? If justice is a property of institutions viewed holistically through time, what does it require? What's on the measuring stick? And there's two broad categories of answer. And I'll just do it sort of Margaret Thatcher style. Some of you may recognize this. You might say, well, here's two societies, two sets of social institutions generating distributions. One set of distributions is roughly like this. So imagine a set of institutions that through time generates a pretty equal society. And imagine another society committed to high growth, which is very unequal, and it generates a distribution over time like this. Which of these two societies is just? Which of them is more fair? Which of them better reflects which of these set of institutions better reflects our commitment to respect each of our fellow citizens' lives as being worthy and worthwhile? What do you think? Kind of like this one, right? But note, and it's very apparent it's in Mill, it's in Keynes, and it's in Rawls, and it's not an accident that it's in all three. All three of those thinkers argue that a just society can be achieved in a stationary state. That is, all three of those thinkers, interestingly, consistently, say you can achieve justice within a stationary state. But my relatives are pro-growth. They want it. They really want growth for all kinds of reasons. And so they're committed to the idea of economic liberties, in part because they care about economic growth. Now, over time, a society which is not committed to growth or skeptical of growth or reluctantly capitalist may grow more slowly than one which is really enthusiastic about growth. So now imagine looking at it through time, this society starts going like this. And it's getting even, my fingers aren't getting long enough, but even wider and more unequal. Now we ask again, which of these two sets of institutions is just? Which of them is more fair? Which of them better reflects our commitment to respect the lives of all of our fellow citizens, including the least well off? Well, the Hayekian Rawlsian answer is this: watch my thumbs. We ask which is most respectful, which is most democratically required, by asking how the least well off among us fare, at least the well off, the people who are willing to work, and how they fare, the lowest paid wage laborer, let's say. And if this society, the lowest paid wage laborer, will be paid more than in this society, then this is the more respectful set of institutions. So social justice can be compatible with respecting economic liberties, provided we also add a little kicker, an institutional kicker, about being enthusiastic about growth. And growth becomes a policy now, which may generate inequalities, but as a friend of social justice. So you can have those erstwhile uncombinables combined. There's a way of reasoning, and I'll close with this slide. This is what I think happened. I think in the 20th century, 19th century and 20th century, there were some, I'll just give it to them, brave people on the left who broke away from classical liberalism because they felt the sting of the Marxist critique. They felt the power of Marx's idea that formal equality without material wealth is a sham. The right to have tea at the Ritz for those who can afford it. They people recognize, the worth of liberty matters too. It's not just having liberty that should count. It's having the liberty should be valuable. And you need stuff to make your liberties valuable. Everybody does need stuff to make their liberties valuable. And so they worked out a theories of social justice. But what was going on was that they didn't realize that when they thought they were giving theories of social justice, they were actually just giving a whole bunch of variations on one species of social justice. a species that I call social democratic. And each and every theory of social justice, except mine, is social democratic. Each one of them has these two features. First, it minimizes the importance of private economic liberty. They all do. Every one of them minimizes the importance of private, in part because they think that you have to limit the power of the state. Get them to the power of individuals so that the state can do these things. This happened historically, too, with FDR, for example, in the US. You need to limit economic liberty so that you can achieve social justice. They also think that social justice is a matter of equality, including political participation, rather than economic wealth. But there's the opportunity now, and I'll close with this thought, that we stand now at an opportunity for democratic theory to enter what I think of as the undiscovered country, which are democratic theories which are what I call market democratic. What Sweden, for example, is fast becoming, moving along the democratic continuum away from social democracy of Sweden's failed past 1970s or unsustainable policies towards something like a market democratic future. And the really important point that I want to make is that in a lot of societies that are marketizing, including perhaps India, though I'm not sure, certainly Sweden, and a lot of societies that are marketizing, they're marketizing because of economic forces. They're becoming market democratic, looking down the barrel of an economic gun. And in those societies, people will still have these moral ideals, these bankrupt, ancient moral ideals that make them think that, in fact, we have to do it, but we shouldn't be doing it. My suggestion is that normativity does not only blow towards the left, it actually blows strongly to the right. It's morally better. It's a more robust, a more attractive account of democratic community when we recognize private economic liberties. We don't give up the idea that all our citizens matter, but we now recognize the moral possibility that, in fact, these economic reforms that have been forced upon countries are also moral improvements at the same time. Then we marketize, we respect our citizens in a broader range of ways. And if we can marketize and respect them in a broader range of ways so that they all benefit, then we develop perhaps the fairer society of them all. And I'll close with that. Thank you.
First thing, I think context came up in the last discussion. I should say that from where I am sitting and the place or the world I occupy, the world looked different. The two camps were really the ones which were really against each other and in their own separate igloos were not of the left liberals on one side and the libertarians on the other, but really the liberals on one side and the communitarians on the other, really asking about what should be the nature of the political community. And that is a very fundamental difference here. But let's go with it. And I said, OK, let me shelve aside and let me have an outsider's point of view and assume that there are these two camps which are really fighting for the issues that we have been, over issues that we are discussing today. And when I look at them, again, from the position I have, my subject position, the scenario appeared different. It wasn't merely that, as you put it, that the second group of left liberals occupied a high moral ground, or that they had taken seriously what Marx had pointed out to them, because many before had also talked about really the industrial poor and so on and so forth, et cetera, et cetera. But the issue really to me was, it appears to me, is that the left liberals were asking questions to the libertarians, which in some sense the questions came from the libertarian logic itself. For instance, let's go with protecting property rights. But what about just acquisitions? That is what John Locke's theory would tell us. You have to protect property rights provided it is through just acquisitions. So what do we do when we recognize that the distributions at the moment or property holdings as they are at this time are not the result of just acquisitions? So where do we go from there? Or if I take John Locke's own statement initially in the second treatise seriously, his opening statement that all men are by nature equal. So if they are by nature equal, what do I owe to them? And what does this, and you talk about equal respect later on, what does equal respect really entail? And then there is this issue, is buying and selling and fairness of contract enough for fulfilling that ideal of treating each other as equal? as persons who have equal moral worth. And I thought the left liberals had this answer, or maybe not the left liberals alone, but many others, and I have really the great Hegelian traditions in mind here, that there is the issue of treating each other as equal, implying some degree of one's ability to be intersubjective, giving due recognition to other people. And surely recognition is not a matter merely of contract and fair contract. It requires something more for me to be able to be concerned with how something affects you. Even my most trivial actions might affect you. And that certainly is more than merely that. So I thought that perhaps from this vantage point, they were asking questions, and then there were these issues really of what are the conditions under which there can be a system of cooperation. And if there is to be a system of cooperation in which everyone will participate, how do I arrive at those rules and laws which, assuming the libertarians also want it, because they want, we are told all through the day, rule of law. But then how are those laws to be framed? And then to left liberals, I thought, were trying to give answers, a different set of answers, because those questions lingered on from the libertarian framework. So I thought there is, and I wanted to put it like that, because even though in your lived experience there could be these two camps, in one's moral reasoning, they seem to be interconnected in terms of the questions they are raising. And I don't think all of left liberal traditions were really stepping away from that earlier tradition. They were going along with the questions they were raising, adding some more questions, finding the answers less than adequate. And that's the starting point of all this, to my mind. I think the scenario that John has drawn is a very interesting one. It's a very interesting one because it forces us to think beyond the dichotomies that we have been rehearsing a lot of the time in this room today and even outside in various scenarios. The fact that you have to choose. You have to choose between economic liberties and, on the other side, what you call democratic citizenship or social justice. And I think it's very, very important to really go beyond this dichotomy and try to find how we might think in terms of future scenarios. And I think what John has said is very, very interesting at that point, at that level. But nevertheless, let me raise a few questions in order to take this discussion forward a little bit. I agree. And I think this is, and here I'm going to go back to bits that you have actually elaborated in greater detail in the paper, but you hinted at here. If we were to begin with the idea, as you do, that economic liberty is important, and in the paper you spell it out, not just for institutional reasons, but because it really pushes you into treating other people with respect, or giving them some kind of moral autonomy, because it makes you a better, you call them, that's part of becoming an adult, that this is what it does. And I think there is some truth in that, and I think that statement has to be taken seriously. And I take it seriously in the following way. And I would just use different words, and I think we might agree there, that work is very important. Work is a condition, is a mode of self-expression, and I agree entirely with that. I also would go further and say that actually it is the source of leading a decent life, and hopefully a decent life with dignity. So work is important. So having some ability, some amount of work is important. I would go further and agree with you and say that being able to choose what I want to do and to plan my life the way I want to live it, to have the occupation I want, is certainly a better position than living in a scenario or a society, even Platonic society, which tells me what I am best suited for, let alone a caste-divided society, which actually says what you cannot do or what you should be doing. So certainly if those are my choices, then this idea that we need to be able to make choices about the occupations we have, so that I have some capacity of decision-making economic field, I think is extremely important. It is very important for who I am and the kind of person I am likely to be. But I would submit that this is only an aspect of what is important. And I would be able to make this point further, I think, clarify what I have in mind by taking on the example you have taken from feminist literature. women wanted the right to work. Women wanted the right to be able to step into the market. And I think part of that really was not because economic liberty alone. Economic liberty is important, but not economic liberty alone. Part of that, to my mind at least, the struggle at that time was really for overcoming exclusions. The fact that you cannot, not because, this is the way only forward for my realizing and becoming who I am. And I think it's modes of exclusion which are very, very significant here. They needed to be overcome. And that's why this was important. The other reason it was very important is, and I think you sort of slipped into it at different moments, it is part of entering into the public domain, of participating as a citizen in a conversation which you call of democratic citizenship, of deliberation, etc. So I would submit to you that even though economic liberty is a valued good, I don't think this is a valued good, to use your words from the paper, that should trump all other social concerns. And that's what I'm most cautious about, and I have some anxiety about, that I think we need to place it alongside other values. Some values that Stephen listed previously, but there are a whole range of other values, because this is part of my personal liberty value system, but there are other values of care, of equal recognition, and I think it has to be placed alongside that. And if we were to take those other elements out of the equation and merely say that economic liberty really paves the way for making me a morally worthwhile person, I think something is lost. And I think something is missed into this entire equation. And I want to come back now to another issue of democratic citizenship, because that's the term you have used periodically. And I want to submit here, again, for your consideration, something which is, as it were, supplementing what you have said. You have talked about democratic citizenship, which you said you'll take that from the left liberals. And I really, from my vantage point, I'm not concerned with what each of them is saying and whether they are saying what you say they are saying or something else. But the point really to me is democracy democracy involves deliberation. But is deliberation the single most important ingredient of democracy? Because one might also say that democracy is about ensuring what I would call, in my work, I've called it social non-discrimination. The fact that the identities I am born with do not determine the opportunities that I have and the rights I am able to exercise in my life. And I think that could be a liberal virtue. I don't need necessarily to go very far from there. But how is that to be realized? I might also go along with what you say and what many have said about the importance of economic liberty. My concern really is that economic liberty might yield all the goods that you are suggesting that it will yield, provided certain conditions are met. And I think we haven't talked about the kind of conditions that need to be met for this promise to be delivered. And some of the conditions that need to be met, and I'm living in India, and I think this is not untrue of many other parts of the world, including United States, that gross economic inequality, persistent social inequalities are certainly stumbling blocks to delivering the promise that economic liberty bears for us. And I think we need really, therefore, to talk about that and to put that in front. And I'll just end by giving one or two examples. I think for too long, and I want to go along with the methodological layout that you have made, that we have to go beyond these dichotomies that we are getting, two boxes that we are getting fixed into. We need to be able to move and maneuver ourselves around. And to me, the one box is, are we going to go for free market or are we going to go for regulation? And I think it is time, I agree with you entirely, to go beyond that. And the reason to go beyond that is the following. That if, I'll give one example, in India, you are thinking in terms of, of course, I'm all for having more and more players, let's say, in the education field, and many more people to come, and I want people to be able to make those choices. But what if those choices, that people have made those choices with the promise that certain things will be delivered to them? What if those promises are not kept. Now, you may say this is bad faith and therefore the state has to regulate, but if it happens persistently, or if it happens persistently in a way that actually reinforces prejudices and exclusions, then you would need to think in terms of regulation. And I think we need, the concept we have missed out in all this is how do we really ensure that the rights of citizens are protected, because that's a very basic condition of democracy. And we might want to bring something more in, not on grounds of high moral, whatever virtue, because there'll be debates about what is high moral ground and how we are determining who I am, what is good for the person, but for the fact that this is what this system of cooperation involves, that I want the same kinds of liberties and rights that are given to everybody else. And I think that would require some amount of I don't know, because every word has become bad. Regulation is bad, interference is bad, but intervention. They would require some form of collective, not just collective deliberations, but also ways of thinking centrally about how do I protect the rights of other peoples and not my own rights.
I really like the point Gurpreet mentioned about the importance of entering into the public domain, and the worry that the market scheme that I'm describing seems to let markets trump all other values. And there may be communitarian values or values of political participation that are left out of this account that I'm giving. And that could be a reason that there's some moral loss in the view that I'm describing. I think she's absolutely right. But I really want to emphasize how right she is. Because what I most want to do, for a long time, this was the only game in town for people who would openly say things like one of their fundamental moral powers is to recognize the capacity of our fellow citizens and the importance of their lives. So they're on the high moral ground for anyone who accepted that premise for a very long time. What I want to do, though, and this is the part I like most about the project, I want to put a moral challenger up against them. So we can actually now look at two different ways of respecting each other. And I've been emphasizing one of the distinctions I make, that on the market democratic range of theories of social justice that we could develop, one of their features that recommends them is over these guys, is that they better respect private economic liberty. But let me add one other piece now. There's something else that's really attractive about this and really profoundly unattractive about all of these. Briefly, John Rawls, there's this puzzle in Rawlsiana. There's tons of books and articles about Rawls, but there's this puzzle about Rawls that economists pointed out from the very beginning. Rawls says two things that seem incompatible. He says, I'm committed to the difference principle. That I'm committed to the idea that the just society is the one which, through the course of time, does the best for the least well-off. He's committed to that's his basic moral principle of distribution. But he also says, consistently, that justice is attainable within a stationary state or a no-growth economy. Well, how can that be? How can, if I did this with my fingers, a society that aims at growth is going to have a lot more for the least well-off than a society that doesn't aim at growth. So how can he see both these things? The solution was hinted at what you said, and what you just said, is that when Rawls talks about maximizing the benefits to the least well-off, he has to use a very particular and unattractive, I submit, account of what it means to benefit the least well-off. The bundle of there's a complex index of primary goods that have to be maximized. That index includes a whole bunch of different kinds of things, including wealth. But it also includes opportunities to have positions of authority and power. Now, Rawlsians are now finally admitting, because I'm sort of pushing them to do it, that the reason that Rawls can combine those two things, that he thinks that among the most important, weightiest things on that index is the idea of workplace democracy. That if people have the choice of living in a society where they make more and more money, or living in a society where they have more and more meetings to go to in the workplace, they prefer more and more meetings and less money. Don't get me wrong, they actually had to prefer less and less money. They have to give that up. Not all goods are compatible, or they have to make a choice. So their view turns out to be doubly unattractive, I think. First, it requires that they boss other people around in economic demands of their lives. That's not very pleasant. But what's worse, when they talk about social justice, it turns out, and people like Liz Anderson are explicit about this now. They're coming out of the woodwork to defend the view because they have no choice but to defend it. They have to say that we think we benefit the least well-off by making them go to meetings. I don't think the working class people I know in my family like going to the meetings. They don't. Maybe some professors do like going to department meetings, therefore, no. It's the domain of bullies. So anyway, I think there is a real divide between people who think that community means political community, and they want to have democracy in more and more places in our lives, and that's their ideal of a good society, and people like me on the market democratic side who think community means living together symbiotically with people pursuing very different goals and views of life, and yet having the structures arranged in such a way that as you pursue your good life, even if you don't know me or care about me, your activities slop over into my bucket and help me pursue mine. I think that's a more attractive conception of community. But it's a fundamentally different one. And my aim is to flush these guys out, all of them, because they're all social democrats, and as such, they have a morally flawed ideal. It's not an ideal that working people, most of all, would actually find attractive. It's an ideal, I think, of a very narrow, elite conception of society. Once you see it, I don't think we like it. I don't.
Thank you.